Welcome to Hebrew Grammar 1. This is chapter 5 of the first Hebrew primer. And I thought what I'd do in this lecture is, instead of creating a separate PowerPoint, is to walk through the grammar itself and talk a little bit about using the book as we address looking at chapter 5 for this week. So in this chapter we're going to look at nouns and verbs, which we've already introduced both of those concepts, but we're going to look at feminine nouns and feminine verbs. Up to this point in the course we've only covered masculine singular nouns and verbs. Now, each chapter has this oral review at the beginning, and I would encourage you to work through these. You don't have to turn this in. It is oral review. It's not something that you have to write down as part of your homework. But I would encourage you every week, the more exposure you can get to hearing what Hebrew sounds like and reading it, the better equipped you're going to be and the better you're going to learn. And these oral reviews are all based on things you should already know pretty easily up to this point based on what we've covered so far. So I would encourage you to just read it out loud. Here it's like number 1, David Zakar is David remembered. And then just do a quick translation. If you have the Logos version, if you click on the little star here, I'm not going to do it now, it does have a narrator that will read the Hebrew for you. And those are good pronunciations of the Hebrew there. Okay, the vocabulary for this week. I'm just going to read them so you can hear what they sound like, beginning in the upper right. Av is father or ancestor. Av. Think of the name Avraham, right? Father of many nations is how that is. This meaning of that name is described in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament. So Av is the name father. El, this is a preposition that means to, toward, or for. El. And here we just have the gloss to. Below that is the word Isha. Isha is the word for woman or wife. Isha. And you can see that F on the side means it's a feminine noun. The M up here on Av means it's a masculine noun. And we'll talk about how you can tell the difference with most nouns just by looking at them in a moment. The fourth word here is Behema. Behema, which is animal or cattle, a feminine noun. Bat is the word for daughter. It's also feminine, bat. Here we have another pronoun. We already learned the pronoun for he, and that's who, right? Who is he? And then this one, he, is she. So this is kind of funny, but the Hebrew word he means she, and the Hebrew word who means he. So who is he, and he is she. It's maybe a good way of remembering those pronouns. And again, it's a feminine third person singular pronoun. He is she. Now here we have a verb, halak, one of the most common verbs in the Hebrew Bible. It means to walk or go. So walked, halak. Up here we have a proper name, Yerushalayim is how you pronounce that. There's that little diphthong at the end, so it's a little weird to say. It's Yerushalayim is Jerusalem, and that is a feminine noun. We have another preposition here, min, which means from or out of. Below that is another proper name, Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, and that's the word for Egypt, also feminine. Many place names are feminine. Below that is the word for family or clan, and it's mishpacha. Mishpacha, also feminine. Here we have the word for young woman is na'ara. Young woman, feminine noun, na'ara. And then two proper names at the end of this. Ruth is the word for Ruth, Ruth. And then Sarah is the name Sarah, Sarah. All right. Let's go. So the big purpose of this chapter is to look at particularly feminine nouns and verbs. And one thing to point out is that nouns in Hebrew have gender. They're either going to be masculine or feminine. Now in English, some words are feminine, some are masculine just by the nature of the words. You know, man, woman, waiter, waitress, steward, stewardess, that type of thing. But in Hebrew, every single noun has to be put in the category of either masculine or feminine. And those nouns don't change gender. They're the same. They're always going to stay the same. So a word is always going to either be masculine or always either be feminine. And every word has to be put into one of those two grammatical categories. And I do want to point out that they are just grammatical categories. So while things that are naturally feminine will be considered grammatically feminine as well, there are many things that have to be considered masculine or feminine, but because they're put in that category, it isn't really necessarily saying anything about their masculinity or femininity. For example, the word, davar, is masculine grammatically. That doesn't mean there's something masculine about words in general. It's just saying the word davar grammatically is masculine. It inflects like a masculine noun. Whereas the word mishpacha is feminine. That's the word for family or clan. Again, not that there's anything particularly feminine about a family or clan, but it's grammatically going to follow the rules of a family or clan. So, how do you tell if a noun is feminine? Well, the best way is to look at a lexicon. And in a future video in another week, I'll talk through your lexicon and how to use it. But in general, grammatically, feminine nouns can usually be identified by some specific characteristics. So one of the main ones is nouns that end with a long A followed by a hey, or a comet's hey. If the word ends with that, the noun ends with that, they're usually feminine. That's the most common feminine singular noun ending. So for example, from our vocabulary, we have mishpacha. See that final comet's hey ending? That tells you that it's a feminine noun. Or on young woman, na'ara. That tells you it's a feminine singular noun, that comet's hey at the end. Now, nouns that also end with the letter tav are usually feminine as well. So like the word daughter ends in bat. See that tav? That tells you it's feminine. Or the word for truth, this wasn't in our vocab, but the word emet, which is the word for truth, that tav there tells you that it's a feminine singular noun. And then as I mentioned in the vocab, names, place names of cities or countries are almost always feminine. Not always, but almost always. So like Mitzrayim, Egypt, and Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, from our vocabulary. You might wonder, well, how do I tell if it's a masculine singular noun? Well, generally, masculine singular nouns are what grammarians call unmarked. That is, there is no ending, and that tells you that they're masculine singular. So if a noun doesn't have the tav or the comet's hey ending, it's probably a masculine singular noun. There are, of course, exceptions, and there are words that grammatically look masculine but are actually feminine, and vice versa. So there are some there is a little bit of ambiguity there. Not ambiguity, but it can be hard to tell. Most words you can tell just by looking at it though. Alright, the gender of verbs. Every verb can be inflected as either masculine or feminine. And so we've already covered masculine singular verbs in a previous chapter. And this is the vocabulary form of the verbs that we learned. They are inflected, if you remember, I said they're inflected as a third masculine singular verb. So halak here, you would translate that, if it were in a sentence in Hebrew, he went, halak, because it's inflected as a third masculine singular verb. Or zakar is he remembered. And in the Cal stem that we're learning, the basic verbal stem that we're learning, perfect conjugation, masculine singular nouns have this vowel pattern, the long A, short A, the comets followed by a patak. That is the pattern from third masculine singular Cal perfect verb. So see that they all have that comets patak. And that does make them kind of sound the same. This is one of the reasons why vocabulary for verbs can be difficult. The vocabulary form, they'll have the same vowels in them. So you have shama, shamar, zakar, amad, halach, malach. And that can create some challenges for memorization, but that is how you tell that it's a third masculine singular verb. Now what if you wanted to say she went or she ruled? What if we wanted to have a third feminine singular verb? Well, the way you do that is you take the same form of the verb and you add a comet's hey to the end. So that also creates some additional vowel changes. So you'll notice the first comets is still there. The second, normally what was a patak in the third masculine singular, that changes to a shava or shortens to a shava. It's a vocal shava here, followed by a comet's hey at the end. So halakha is she went, or zakara is she remembered, or shama'a is she heard. So notice the pattern, the vowel patterning is the same in all of these words. And that's how you tell it's a third feminine singular. And even though there's no subject stated, you would translate that she went. Just like up here, halak is he went. Even though there's no subject stated, the subject is implied in the form of the verb. Now, there needs to be agreement between the subject and the verb. If you have a subject that's masculine, the verb also has to be masculine. Or if the subject is feminine, the verb has to be inflected as a feminine. So just from our vocab, we have, let's go all the way to the right. We have hu amad. Hu is the word for he. Amad is the word for stand. It's inflected like a masculine singular verb. He stood. If you wanted to say she stood, you'd say he amada. He is the word for she, and then it's inflected like a third feminine singular verb. Or if you put a proper name in there, David shamar, David stood, David guarded rather, and then Sarah shamara, Sarah guarded. See how it's inflected as a third feminine singular. And this relates to this next concept of roots. The Hebrew language is built on a system of triconsonantal roots, that is, roots that are almost all boiled down to 3 consonants. And that's true for verbs and for nouns. So we've looked at this a little bit in our vocabulary up to this point. Like, for example, you have the root, and this is how roots are going to be written in the textbook. So this is helpful to know. You have, the mem, dot, lamed, dot, kaf. And what this is saying is this is just the root. And those 3 root consonants, you can put different vowels or prefixes or suffixes on them to change them into different nouns or to different verbs. So the root malak, if it's malak, you can translate it, he ruled. Melek, that's a noun form of king. Or another noun, malkut, it's a feminine singular noun that means kingdom. You have that ut ending. But it's all from the same root. Or shamar, that root can be inflected as a perfect masculine singular verb, right? He guarded, third masculine singular verb. Shomer, it's another different vowel patterning there as a guard. Or mishmar, that's actually the word for prison. See, there's a mem prefix on it, but you have the same 3 root consonants, and that's the noun for prison. And you can look at the other examples there to see that. So that's just one of the kind of unique things about Hebrew is it has these triconsonantal roots that, depending on how the vowels are, or if there's prefixes or suffixes, can be transformed into lots of different words, which is actually really helpful for vocabulary. So there's a really important relationship between Hebrew roots and Hebrew verbs. Every verb in Hebrew has a root, and it's composed of 3 letters, as I just talked about. And you can see the examples there from what we've learned in our vocab. So the roots are written with, again, like each consonant separated by a dot. And that tells you that that's the root. Okay, so singular perfect patterns. And I should say this is singular third person perfect patterns, right? This is just saying he or she, not, I heard or you heard or we heard. This is just he heard or she heard, he or she as the subject of the verb. Here's the pattern. You take the root like Shema. If you do the kametz patak, the long A short A, that's he heard. If you do the kametz shava, kametz hey, that is a she heard. And that pattern fits all the way through there. So that's something I would memorize at this point so you know that and get that down cold, and you'll get lots of practice doing it. Okay, shifting away from nouns and verbs for a minute, one of the most common words in Hebrew is the word and. Of course, that's a very common word in English as well. But in English, the word and is a separate word, right? If you have a phrase, and he went, and is its own word. We would count that as its own word. In Hebrew, the word and is not its own word. It's a syllable that's added to the beginning of a word, just like the word the in Hebrew. And it's translated most often as and. And the syllable that's put on the front of the word is a vav consonant followed by a shava. So here you have the noun father, av. What if you want to say and a father? You add the vav, shava, and you just attach it to the beginning of the word. Va'av is and a father. Now, you might be wondering, what if I want to say and the father or and the king? Can you attach it to a word that already has a definite article attached to it? And the answer is, of course, you can do that. So here we have the noun melech or king, and we have the definite article attached to the front that we talked about last week. So that's the king. Well, if you want to say and the king, you just attach a vav to the front, and the king. So this is all one word in Hebrew, v'hamelech, but you'd actually translate it as 3 words in English. The vav is and, the hey is the, and melech is king. So and the king, v'hamelech. Now, normally the vav conjunction and takes a shava, that short vowel, that 2 dots underneath it. That's kind of the standard way of doing it. There are some variations though, and here's several examples of the standard way of doing it. But there are some, like I said, there are some different ways of writing it. One of them is it can be written as a shurik. That is a vav with a dot in the middle. This is actually a vowel called a shurik, and it's pronounced oo, oo. You don't say vu, you don't pronounce the consonant, you just say oo, oo. And it appears that way before what I call the bump rule, before the letters bait, mem, and pay. The vav conjunction is pronounced oo, just like this. It's also pronounced that way before many letters that have a vocal shava attached to it. It's pronounced this way too, if you're wondering about the rules. You don't necessarily have to know the rules, just know that at the beginning of a word is the conjunction and. It can also appear sometimes as vav hirik, vav patak, vav segol, vav tzere, vav kametz. Any of those vowels are possible at the beginning, and it doesn't change the meaning. It just means and. There is a further explanation of this if you want to see it in the footnote. Some of you like to know all the rules. There are rules as to when these different vowels are used. If you want to chat about that at some point, you can with your instructor. But just know that anytime you see a vav at the beginning of a word, it's the conjunction and. It typically has the shava vowel underneath it, but it can be any of these other vowels as well. So here's some examples. You have like bein uvat, so son and daughter, a son and a daughter. This is that bump rule I was talking about before a bait, mem, or pay. You get the shurik, the oo sound for the word and. We have David v'Yerushalayim, David and Jerusalem. Now notice there's some vowel changes here. There's no vowel under the yod anymore. It's shifted to the vav. I wouldn't stress about this. The vowels do have some changes that take place. Just know the vav means and then we have the word Yerushalayim is Jerusalem. So David and Jerusalem. Here you have Bayet Uv Hema, house and an animal. And then David ve'emet, word and truth. Sorry, davar ve'emet, word and truth. Okay. We are also, this chapter has a lot of different things in it. This chapter also talks about the preposition min. So the preposition min means from. And what's unique about this preposition is that it can either be its own word, from, like you could say min habayit, from the house, where here you have min is its own separate word, or you can attach the min preposition to the beginning of a word and it becomes a part of that word. So here we have mibayit. Now when you do that, when the min attaches to the beginning of a word, the noon assimilates. You might wonder, what do I mean by assimilate? What I mean is the noon disappears and it becomes the dot or the dagesh forte in the first root consonant here of house. So it says mibayit, from a house. So just know that it can be written either way. It means the same thing. It's just 2 different ways of handling it. So you may wonder, well, what if, if it's supposed to be a dot, what if you want to attach it to a word that begins with a guttural that can't take the dot? Well, what happens is the I vowel will lengthen to a tsere in compensation for not being able to use the dot or the dagesh there. So meish is from a man. Or you can say min ha'ish, from the man. Okay, so that's one thing to know about the preposition min. There's a couple of other weird things about the preposition min that we'll cover later on in the course. Okay, the use of it in Hebrew, the pronoun hu, which is he, or he, which is she, can also be translated it. when it's referring to like an object. In English, we have this neutral pronoun it, and sometimes it makes sense to translate the pronoun in that way in Hebrew as well. So for example, in this sentence we have Habayit amad, the house stood, v'hu shamar mishpacha. And literally this is he guarded a family, but it's referring back to house, which in English we would call a house an it, not a he. So we'd say the house stood and it guarded a family. And then you go on to your exercises for this chapter.